Hey folks, this is Sani Fahuri aka Darf Caboose here and welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be playing a third campaign of Labyrinth, The War on Terror. And yet it's not going to be just Labyrinth, The War on Terror, which, in case you don't know, is a game developed by GMT Games and whose main developer is Volko. We're actually going to be playing a mini expansion for the game, or the first expansion for the game, which is called Labyrinth, The Awakening. And this covers the more recent events that has occurred in the Middle East between 2010 to, well, the present day. So this is going to be an introductory video of where to get all these things and how to process them. And we'll also be doing a comprehensive look at the rules and how things change on the main board. So, the very first thing you want to do in order to get started is to go to your favorite local, browser. I like to use Chrome, and just type in Labyrinth: The Awakening, and that should get you pretty far. The first search result will actually be a link to GMT Games, which has all of the stuff you need to play the game. You'll get to their nice GMT website, and you'll see some information here. Prices and all that stuff. If what we're interested in is getting the Vassal module, as well as some of the player aids you need to play the game, as well as the rules. So we'll go to the playtest website over here, I would strongly recommend that you join the playtest group if you're interested in playing this, either through Vassal or develop the components at a time. But feel free to give a email to the game's developer, Joel Toppen. I have sent an email yet, but I haven't heard a response from him yet. So, Joel, if you're watching this, Sani Fahuri, aka Darf Caboose, would love to join in and give great feedback about this game. So, all right. So, what do you need to get started? Well, the first thing you want to do is from this section, you want to go over to downloads. And this is going to be pretty much everything you need. You could look at all the announcements if you'd like to. This sort of gives you some idea of what you should focus on because the game is still very much in a alpha/beta kind of phase, and there's a lot of things still going on. Although it has settled out. I haven't seen any changes to the downloads since then. There's also some information about how to set up the game. But what you really want is to go to the downloads section. And the downloads section of this particular site is going to have pretty much everything you need. The very first thing you'll notice is at the very bottom item here is the Vassal module. This is the VMod. And not only just click on the little arrow here and it takes you to a download section, you can get it that way. However, so you'll download that, and when you go to the Vassal section, you will see it pop up here, which is that right there. We'll open up the game in a second, but I'm going to point out some of the other important things you want to look at. You pretty much want to look at all these sections here. The module notes is there to sort of tell you how to do certain things in Vassal itself. There's a couple of new cards that requires a bit of player manipulation to get working, so it'll tell you how to do that there. There's also a couple of new overlays that you have to place at certain times that tells you how to do that. So that's the first part. The next section is really cool. If you like to take a look at all the new cards and see what they do and how they work, you can click on the final draft section here. And this has a really cool list of all the different cards you can see here. I won't spoil all of them. I'll just show you. They look really cool. The artwork is still kind of in progress because some of the art is a bit big for the cards. But yeah, these are some of the new cards. The next section is the cards list. And this is a really tiny but complete list of all the cards that comes with the new game. Notice that towards the bottom, there are actually some cards from the base Labyrinth game that you will include in any games that you play with The Awakening. And in fact, you could actually play a mega game where you combine The Awakening with the base Labyrinth game, but we won't be doing that here. I think also because the Vassal module doesn't support that very easily. So there's that. And then we'll cover this. The markers. This is great if you want to do a print and play of this game. This has all the markers you need. There's quite a few, including the overlays and some other things as well. We'll cover that in a bit. And then you have probably the three that I'm going to be using the most when I'm playing this game on stream here for you guys to see. There's going to be a list of the unchanged cards. Rather, it should be called the list of changed cards because there is some text on them that is modified when you're playing The Awakening. For example, there is a card known as Sharia, which is in the base game, and typically what that card does is remove a besieged regime marker. However, in this game, there's also a extra thing added to that card, which is to place an Awakening marker there. So whenever we play these base game cards in a game of Labyrinth the Awakening, we will have to consult this chart here and make sure that we do everything needed on that card. We will keep track of this throughout the game. So I'm going to leave this tab open for this playthrough. The next thing we need is the rules. And, well, I'm not going to mince words. The rules are quite detailed. It's a couple of pages at least of new information that we'll have to tackle in due time. But it's good to have this open. I'll be consulting this stuff. Of course, the base rules of Labyrinth still apply, so you should have a good knowledge of that. And hopefully, having watched both of my previous campaign videos, campaign number 1, campaign number 2, you'll have a decent enough idea of how Labyrinth goes. But this does add some new things, and we'll be covering these rules in detail in this video. The last thing we're going to be using, and this is probably the most exciting part of this, is the new bots. So, a person by the name of Adam Zahn has created a new set of bots, and not just a jihadist bot, but also a bot for the United States. How cool is that? You can now play as either side. You don't have to just play as the US, you can now actually play as the jihadists. And I may just do that for the first video. This isn't just a new bot for the US, though. There are some changes that have been made to how both of the bots, to how the jihadist bot works. It's a bit more intelligent, I would say. I think it reacts to the board a bit better, although at the same time it isn't more complex. So just to show you how this works, over here is the jihadist operations flowchart, and much like the flowchart from the base Labyrinth, the War on Terror game, there are two sections, right? The top section is, do you play the card for the event or the operations, and if so, what kind of operations is it? And then the bottom half is, okay, once you've figured out what type of operation it is, where is it going to happen? And you can see here it's a bit more intelligent. It actually looks at things like its own funding. Is the funding tight? Is it moderate? It looks at things like, okay, are there cells available? Well, that was already in the base game. And there are quite a few more priorities to select from, which is interesting. And it even makes some interesting exception of, okay, Pakistan, which is typically a battleground state, is important until the arsenal of Pakistan is captured by the jihadists, in which case it's no longer that important. So it actually makes a little modification where it says, okay, is there an arsenal there? If not, then so be it. The United States chart is just as detailed, although it's actually over 2 pages. One big part of the page is about whether the U.S. will alert plots or not, and there's this very, I'll say, colorful table here that sort of shows that right there. It's very interesting. If I do play as the jihadist, I would like to see how this table works and give my feedback for these videos. So that's that. That's the bots. Okay, let's get started. And we are going to go ahead and open up the Vassal module and just select things as is and get going. So we're going to be, once you download the Vassal module from the website I just showed you, you want to click on, it's called Labyrinth 2. You just double click on that guy right there. And again, it'll open up that handy dandy wizard. Although it's a little bit less handy because it doesn't come pre-programmed with the base scenarios of Awakening, we are instead going to have to create the board. And I'll be doing that while doing the rules explanation as well. And are we recording? Yes, we are. Looks like everything is good to go. So, is it opening? It takes a bit of time to do so. There it is. Okay, so we're going to start a new game offline. Yes. Please? Uh-oh. I may have updated Java recently, so it could be a little on the slow side. I'd like to show you the main map while we're doing this, but come on. Okay, fine. Let's go ahead and cover some of the rules while that's processing, I suppose. So, Labyrinth the Awakening, 2010 ? Is sort of the first expansion of the game. And it's there to attempt to add some of the more recent events that have occurred in the Middle East and Southeast Asia and part of the Muslim world to the game. So Labyrinth, the War and Terror, originally came out in 2011. And that was essentially towards the end of the commitments of the United States in Iraq. And, well, Afghanistan has been out for a while. But since then, we had seen a number of interesting events. The first of which is the Arab Spring, which was a series of protests and revolts throughout the Middle East that had been sort of a reaction to the long-time dictatorial rules, the governance of some of the, I would say, some of the worst dictators of all time, and a bringing in of good governance. However, it's not all sunshines and rainbows. There were also a number of civil wars that had been spawned from these events. Labyrinth: The Awakening attempts to capture these events into the gameplay mechanics that it includes. Let's see if that thing is done. I think it might just be stalled. I may have to restart this. So I will do just that. Okay. Back to the intro. So there's some nice details here about how sort of the design philosophy came out, but we'll be jumping straight into the rules. Okay. So some of the first rules you have is something known as awakening and reaction. And I'm just going to open up the markers again because I can't get the Vassal module to work. These take the form of these little chits here, the blue chits and the green chits. As you can imagine, awakening is something that helps the United States. Reaction is something that helps the jihadists. You can think of this as these markers as sort of a reaction to how the Arab Spring worked, how moderates sort of got up and woke up and decided, you know what, we're gonna try taking back the government to our hands, and how there was a counteracting reactionary movement that tried to take advantage of the power vacuum created. So there's that. Pretty much how it works is awakening markers and reaction markers are markers that are placed typically or most frequently by events. So some of the new events in this game will say place a awakening marker, or place a reaction marker. And you can have any number of awakening markers or reaction markers in the Muslim country. They can only be placed in Muslim countries. Non-Muslim countries don't have a sufficient population to be awakened or reacting against, so it doesn't apply there. Okay, so what do these markers do? Well, every awakening marker adds 1 to every die roll for War of Ideas, Jihad, or Major Jihad, and reaction markers subtract 1. This means that it makes the War of Ideas for the United States harder if there are reaction markers, and easier to do Jihad if there are reaction markers, and vice versa for awakening markers. So that's a really big deal. You can think of them as like a bit of a mini aid, right? But they have other consequences as well. It basically makes it so that it's easier for one country to deal with it than another. So it can make it easier for one side to react to the country than the other. Notice that these modifiers do not apply to affect plots in any way. So this is really just for War of Ideas, Jihad, and Major Jihad. You may have countries that have both awakening and reaction markers. You don't remove them if they cancel each other out. Rather, you leave them there, and you just take the net of the awakening and reaction markers and apply the modifier thusly. There's some nice examples in the rules here that explains that. Once a country gets to either good governance or Islamist rule, those markers are removed. So once it gets to either side that cares to have that country to be at, they go away. Also, if a country falls into civil war, then those markers are gone as well. And we'll talk about civil war later on. It's another key mechanic of this expansion. One key thing about these markers is that every time the governance improves a level or degrades a level, then an awakening or reaction marker is removed, respectively. And there's a nice design over here. It kind of so if you have a population that wants to improve governance, they'll work at it until those goals are met, and they're like, okay, well, we're done, we're out of here. So that's important to keep note of. Okay. Another key thing about these markers is what happens at the end of the turn. So at the end of a hand of cards, you have something that's known as polarization. And polarization is sort of for a taking stock of how much awakening and reaction is in each country, and sort of having governance or allegiances modified based on that. So you can see here, before dealing new cards during the end of turn phase, you perform a country-by-country census of all awakening and reaction markers. And the way it works is as follows. If there is only a net of 1 or 0 on the awakening reaction markers, nothing happens. If one side is at 2, so if there's 2 more awakening than reaction markers, or 2 more reaction than awakening markers, you place another of that type of marker there. And then finally, if you're at 3 or more, then you will first shift the country's alignment towards that side. Ally for the US with awakening, adversary with reaction for the jihadists. And then if they're already at that position, at that alignment, then you change the governance one level appropriately. So, again, awakening, you go to good, and jihadist, you can actually go to Islamist rule, which is interesting. You don't just stop at poor, you go all the way down to Islamist rule. Now, remember, every time the government degrades or improves, you remove a marker of that type. So if you're at 3, and so that if you're at like 3 reaction and it goes from fair to poor, you would remove a reaction marker, it goes back down to 2. So when it comes around to next time, you'd have to place another reaction marker and do it again. So it's slow. It's a very slow process, but the reward is if you can spend the events to invest in the politics of the country, you can actually have these sort of free events or these free shifts in governance happen for you, which is great. It adds an element of play that is less, okay, if I want to do something, I have to do this, or I have to spend a card to do this. Rather, okay, I'm going to spend my time investing in the politics in Egypt and have it, in the long run, come up to be better for me in the long run. So, I like that. It adds a bit of flavor to the game. Although, admittedly, this is something you have to maintain at the end of each turn, so it does slow the game down a bit. But there's that. I'm going to double check the vassal. Okay, I think it's just stalled out, so I may have to close and open up again. I may do another video tackling the actual module, and this will just be the introductionary rules and everything. Okay, so that's polarization. The next up is convergence. Okay, so yeah, convergence is a really big deal. Whenever a country goes to good or Islamist rule, the rest of the Muslim world hears about this and decides they want to follow along in that step too. However, this is randomly done. So when a country goes to good, you roll on for a random Muslim country, and then you will place an awakening or reaction marker of the player's choice. So like if the United States converts Saudi Arabia to good, they can place an awakening marker in a random country. However, if the marker ends up in a good Islamist rule or civil war country, remember civil war countries can't get awakening or reaction markers, then instead the opponent places one in a country adjacent of their choice. It's still the same type of marker. So if the US does it and it ends up in a good Islamist rule or civil war country, then the Islamist player picks which adjacent country to place that good marker in. Notice that convergence cannot occur during polarization because that would just cause multiple polarizations to occur. So it's you kind of do all the polarization, then you do the convergence, yada yada. Again, meditate of the rules. Okay, that tackles pretty much everything to do with the awakening and reaction markers. The next thing up is civil war. So civil war is not something that happens naturally. It's something that only occurs by event play. But there are 4 countries in particular that have events tailored for them: Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, that can fall into a state of civil war. Okay, so what is civil war? Civil war is triggered when an event card meets a precondition, but the ending of a civil war doesn't stop the country from entering civil war again. So it could happen. You place a civil war marker in the bottom center of the country's space when it happens. You replace all awakening markers with an equal number of local security forces. Okay, what are local security forces? They are, we'll talk about them a little bit later on, but they essentially act like localized troops. Troops that only work in that country. Okay. You replace all reaction markers with cells. from the funding track. And then you set the country's alignment to neutral roll its governance, so you kind of just reset its governance like you did when it was unmarked, and you test it. If it was a regime-changed country, that's gone. It's now a civil war country. And then anything else just stays the same. So, you can see here everything else stays the same. There's also a thing where while the country's civil war, the jihadist player may auto-recruit in the country just as if it was an Islamist rule or regime-changed country. So they can still auto-recruit there. Okay, and we'll talk about the local security forces. So the United States is typically limited to 15 troops, but now they also have access to 15 of these sort of darker brown colored cubes that are called local security forces. Their key thing, though, is that they cannot deploy, so they're kind of stuck where they are. But at the same time, they don't trigger any prestige loss if they're the only guys in the country. So if Egypt's in a civil war and they have these local security forces there, then it's kind of like they're helping the United States out by slowing the jihadists down, but at the same time, they're not really an embodiment of the United States. They don't gain or lose prestige appropriately. Likewise, if you do a disrupt operation, the U.S. doesn't gain prestige unless there's also U.S. troops in the same country, right? So that's how that works. They can't be placed in non-Muslim countries too, so they can never go to the Philippines. They can never go to the Abu Sayyaf event in the Philippines, or any other non-Muslim country. All right, so that is what those are. A key thing with Civil War countries is that at the end of the phase, after the polarization phase, which would have to do with the awakening and reaction markers, there is a Civil War attrition phase that occurs as well, where sort of each side tries to hit each other's side and inflict losses on them. And the way it works is as follows. In each Civil War country, you group up all of your cubes, which is both troops and the local security forces, and the cells. Each group of 6, either troops or cubes or cells, inflicts a hit on the other player. And then for groups of that last group of 5 or less, you would instead roll a die. And if you get less than or equal to the number of combatants, then you do another hit. So like if you had 3 troops in the country, you roll a die. If it's a 3 or less, you do a hit on them. And a hit is a jihadist hitting the U.S. is the U.S. loses a cube of the U.S.'s choice. And the jihadist would, if a U.S. hit on the jihadist, would be 2 cells hit. Now note, this is not like a disrupt where it goes from sleeper to active and then active removed. These guys are just hit and they're gone. Now, of course, the jihadist, you want to pick your active before your sleepers, but that's something you have to keep in mind. Okay. Notice that this is one way for the jihadists to sort of remove U.S. cubes, but they're not removed, like killed, like gone from the game completely. They just go back to their track. And the jihadists ones also go back to their funding track. So they go away. This means that the side that lost those cells or cubes have to play cards to put them back into the country, but they're not really gone. They're just sort of gone temporarily. Okay, and there's some nice examples here about that. Okay, so there's another key thing here where, and this is kind of funky because like it's a rule, it's a tiny rule, it's written there, but yeah, like the first time I read the rules, I skipped over it because it was so tiny, but it was really important. Whenever a WMD plot goes off in a Civil War country, the U.S. player will remove a local securities forces, one of those dark brown cubes. However, if 2 resolved WMD plots go off at the same time, then the country immediately goes to Islamist rule. No questions asked. It just happens. Which is interesting. I don't know if the bot will ever have that happen, or if I, playing as a jihadist with the US bot, can have that happen. But it's an interesting way of circumventing the typical process of trying to convert a country to Islamist rule. And then finally, a Civil War country ends when either the country becomes Islamist rule, gets to good governance, or some event calls for the end of a civil war. And then upon the conclusion of the civil war, the marker is removed. All of those local security forces are removed as well. They're gone. And then you're just back to the normal rules of play. So a key thing to know about Civil War countries is that first of all, if the country was regime change, that regime change is now gone. And that's very important because it removes the restriction of regime change, which is, first of all, the United States cannot conduct war of ideas unless there are 5 more troops than cells, which is great because it makes things easier for the United States. And the second thing is they can remove their troops from the country because they are not required to keep at least 5 more troops than cells. So, would there be a point in time where the United States wants to wants to place a regime change country into civil war? Possibly. I've looked through the cards. Not all the civil war countries are jihadist cards. So sometimes the U.S. might want to play it for strategic benefit there. Okay. Yeah, so there's that. There's some restriction on the number of cells, troops, and local security forces. It should be noted that there are 15 troops and then 15 local security force markers. So that means the United States could potentially have up to 30 cubes on the board, whereas the jihadists are stuck to their 15. Actually, they do get access to a couple of new cells, but it only brings up to 8. I think it's 18 or 19. So, yeah, the U.S. is a bit of an advantage there, but I don't know. We'll see how it balances out. Okay. All right, it looks like this. I'm going to just close it and see if I can open it again. So we're going to go ahead and battle. Try that one more time. I guess I should have had this open beforehand, shouldn't I? All right, there we go. So we're going to go next. We're going to do new. There's no scenarios built in. And then we'll go to, you can pick your side. We'll pick solo. It means we can pick either. And so, yeah, here's the new map. You can see it's completely unmarked. But there is a new end-of-turn stuff that includes the polarization and attrition we talked about. And also a couple of other changes we'll talk about as well. But let's go ahead and just, reduce this. Do fit width, which is what I like to do. So yeah, there's a couple of new spots on the board that we have to keep track of. Okay, let's continue with the rules. WMDs. So remember in the base game of Labyrinth, there was Pakistan that had the WMDs. And also Central Asia and Russia. Well, it turns out, during Awakening, the WMD stockpiles of Russia and Central Asia have been more secure than they thought. And instead, Syria and Iran are the ones at risk. Okay, so typically when you start a game with Awakening, instead of placing the WMDs in this spot here, you instead place 2 of them in Syria and 1 of them in Iran. And much like how with Pakistan, if the country goes to Islamist rule, the jihadists get the arsenal. The same applies for both Syria and Iran. Now you're probably thinking, Sunny, how does Iran go to Islamist rule? It's a weird country that can never convert. Well, we'll get to that. So hold your horses. So those are the WMDs. WMD alert. Each time the U.S. player successfully alerts or removes a WMD plot for any reason, the U.S. player gets a prestige. I think it's more thematic, right? I mean, if the U.S. spends their time alerting these plots and getting rid of the WMDs, they should be rewarded for their benefits. I honestly think this should be a base Labyrinth, the War on Terror rule that should be there in place. But that's just me. Okay, plots. So the jihadist player is limited to placing each plot marker once per turn. This may seem unusual, but this can happen because it is possible to get more than 6 plots on the board, but you are restricted to placing only each marker once per turn. Although that's kind of odd. When all 6 plot markers become available there. I think what happens is whenever you get a WMD, you actually replace your lowest plot with that. So a plot 1 becomes a WMD. I think. And then once that plot is used up, then you return that 1 plot to the deck. I think that's how that works. I could be wrong, though. Okay, next up. There are 3 new country maps to be added to the game. There is Iran, Mali, and Nigeria. Okay, so Mali is simple enough. Mali is sort of located down here at the bottom of the board. It takes up the first lapsing events spot. And you can see it is a 1 resource, a Sunni Muslim country. Starts off unmarked. And you can see here, it's kind of small. I'm going to zoom in a bit here to show you. It is considered to be adjacent to Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Nigeria. So it's basically adjacent to these three countries. You also have Nigeria over here, which is adjacent to Mali, Sudan, and Kenya, Tunisia. So it's sort of adjacent to these three countries. And it's interesting to note that Nigeria is a poor non-Muslim country. This is the first poor non-Muslim country we've ever seen. And so it has a couple of special rules built into it. Nigeria has been a focus of the group Boko Haram in the past. And so it has a possibility of falling into a Muslim country, which would then be treated as a normal Muslim country. So we'll just go back to the rules here and see Nigeria. So it begins play as a poor non-Muslim country with that reddish-orange background, I suppose. And it flips to a resource level 2 oil exporter Sunni Muslim country with poor governance and neutral alignment. So it'll become a Muslim country if a level 2 or level 3 plot occurs in the country and a success is rolled there. So it becomes a Muslim country when that happens. Its country mat is then sort of placed in that same spot, and it becomes, for all intents and purposes, a Muslim country. However, the Muslim country, that is Nigeria, can flip back to its non-Muslim side if its alignment becomes ally and there are no cells in the country. And it retains that governance level that it was at. So if it was a poor and then it became a Muslim country, then it would sort of flip over and sort of become a poor neutral. But if somehow the United States works at it and there's still some cells there, it becomes a good country, and then it removes all the cells, then it becomes a good non-Muslim country. This is kind of complicated, but it's something that you have to sort of keep track of in the game. And it comes into play when a couple of event cards come out, like Boko Haram, and a few others as well. Okay, so that's Nigeria. Iran is, we all know, it's an exception country. It's not a non-Muslim country. It's an exception country, but it can, after the play of the Iranian elections event, become a regular Muslim country for the rest of the game, and it has some characteristics. We'll refer to this when it comes up. So why is Nigeria treated this way? Well, there's a nice design note here which talks about how Nigeria is primarily split between a Christian and Muslim population, and so that's why it's not necessarily a Muslim country, but at the same time it could become one if the Islamic portion of the country comes into power. Okay, there are a couple of off-map. There's an off-map forces area, which is where some of the troops may go to if they're called to by events. These are considered to be not on the track, so it will degrade the U.S.'s commitments and sort of maybe have it go to war or overstretch. So that's something they have to keep track of. And there's a couple other things as well, but that's pretty much it. There are some new cells, and that's placed by certain events, but we'll talk about these when they come up. Oh yeah, there's also the Caliphate. That's a really big part. Okay, so the Caliphate is one of the last new things that can occur. And this is 11.3.8. Whenever an event, not an operation, whenever an event places 3 or more cells into a civil war, regime change, or Islamist rule Muslim country, then you can declare a new caliphate. So an Islamic caliphate. So you place the caliphate capital marker in that country, and you immediately increase jihadist funding by 2. This caliphate marker counts as 1 extra resource for the Islamists. So that's basically one of the 6 resources you need to win the game. That sort of establishes that there. The marker by itself does not allow a regime change. So if this marker is placed into a civil war country or regime change country, that's not enough for the United States to do a regime change. However, if the country is Islamist rule, then of course they can do a regime change. That doesn't prevent that from happening. The placement of the marker doesn't affect anything else, though. Okay, once you have the caliphate established, you then look at all of the adjacent countries to the caliphate and evaluate whether those countries can also meet the criteria of the caliphate, which is a civil war, regime change, or Islamist rule. And then you place a caliphate marker on those. It becomes sort of a part of the caliphate itself. You continue this process through them, and they can daisy chain through them until you have no more. And this is evaluated immediately. So if a country that's a caliphate capital, and there's a country next to it that becomes an Islamist rule, that country becomes part of the caliphate as well. The caliphate prevents events from being played in those countries. So the U.S. has to be a bit concerned about that because it typically affects U.S. events. But at the same time, any cells that are in the caliphate, whether the capital or in those caliphate adjacents, are flipped to the active side because you can think of it as them providing security and services, right? They're sort of part of a regular army now. So they are active. They can't be asleep. They have to be awake, and they can be affected by the United States. Okay. It's not all good news for the jihadists, though. If the United States is able to convert the country to good governance, then the caliphate marker becomes displaced, and it's moved to another adjacent country that can host the caliphate of the jihadists' choosing. Every time the caliphate is displaced, the jihadists lose a funding, and the U.S. gains a prestige. And, quite important, if the capital is displaced and there are no adjacent countries that it can go to, then it's considered completely removed, and the U.S. gains a further 2 prestige, and the jihadists lose a further 2 funding. Now, the caliphate can be reestablished in the future through another event play, but that is a big deal, right? It adds an incentive for the United States to go after the caliphate when it's established. Okay, that's pretty much it. There is one slight modification because of all the new countries that are added, the new country maps like Iran, Mali, and Nigeria. You also have to modify the global table in the player aid a little bit. And what this really does is anytime you roll a tan 6 black 1 or a Central Asia result, you don't pick Central Asia immediately. Instead, you roll on this table here. So you just roll a single die and you react as if that was there. This affects convergence, by the way, so we'll have to keep track of that. Finally, there's a note here about the US bots and jihad bots, and then we get down to the scenarios. Okay, man, this video has probably been going on for a while, so this is great. It's been 37 minutes or so, yeah. Okay, so we're going to play, so there's a bunch of scenarios here. There's quite a few. There's the Awakening, which is probably what we're going to be doing. This is essentially right after the events of whenever the Tunisian street vendor Mohamed Bouazizi, who was essentially the catalyst of the Arab Spring, happened, and then we sort of take it from there. There is also one that is the Awakening, but instead of Barack Obama being the one in power in 2010, we instead have either Mitt Romney or John McCain, who was the Republican candidates, in power instead. And so things are a little bit different there. So that's another alternative scenario. There's also the Arab Spring, which is a bit more into the events. It actually does some really cool deck manipulation, and it has like the deck split in half. There's one half which is related to the Arab Spring, which was sort of the initial awakening, reaction, marker placement stuff. And then the second half is the more violent Civil War aspect, which has some of the cards dedicated towards that towards the end. There's a Status of Forces Agreement, which is a very big focus on Iraq and sort of the introduction of ISIL. Right, another big part of the game was Daesh, or which is how the Arabs properly call ISIL, or the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. I think that's what they're called. I know they're typically called ISIS or the IS, the Islamic State, but I'll be calling them ISIL or Daesh in this game. So there's that scenario. Then there's a nice tournament, sort of Assad alone, which is just 2 turns, 2 rounds of cards. And the victory condition only depends on the state of Syria at the end. So, Syria has been embroiled recently in the events of the civil war there with sort of the moderate forces versus Bashar al-Assad, but those are also ISIL and a couple other agents at play. So that has to be concerned too. And then there is the ISIL event, which actually has a sort of a caliphate established already, and we take it from there. And then there's a full campaign game, which is essentially you take Labyrinth, the War and Terror, and Labyrinth, the Awakening, put them all together, and bada bing, bada boom, that's your game. This would be really cool to play with, but I don't think the Vassal module supports that because it doesn't have all the cards there. It just has the cards from the new expansion, so tricky to do. For this one, we're going to be playing Awakening. So let's go ahead and modify the board appropriately based on this scenario. Okay, so let's fix the markers first. So we're going to have Prestige. I'm going to be tabbing back and forth. We have, Prestige at, so I'm going to go and make this bigger again. We have Prestige at 5. The GWAT is US is soft, and the world is at hard 2. So this is interesting, right? So this is President Barack Obama. The Democrats are in power, right? So they're that, but the world is apparently hard on the war on terror. It doesn't seem like these snap on as easily. That's a bit of a shame. So the world is hard 2. The US is soft. The troops are at war, so there's enough troops placed that we're considered to be at war. And then jihadist funding is all the way down at 9. Okay. So, 5. I even put it at 5 and I said 9. Okay, good resources at 0. Islamist rule resources at 0. And fair good countries. So this is these poor at 3. And fair good is at 2. Okay. That's all the markers. Now we do the countries. Okay. Algeria, Tunisia is a poor neutral. And it has an awakening marker there. So we're going to put that awakening marker there. So if you go to markers, you can see a new tab there for expansion pieces. And we are going to place a +1 awakening marker on the bottom left of the country. This indicates this country is at a +1 awakening. Okay, Iraq is a poor ally. So it's going to be a poor ally. Shift to ally. Poor ally. There are 2 troops there. And there is 1 single cell there. Okay. But it is not a regime change marker. Remember, around this time, the United States had officially declared an end of combat operations in Iraq. And so, I guess, even though the country is still a poor country, it is considered to not be a regime change country. Okay, the Gulf States is a fair ally, much like before. And it has 2 troops there, just hanging about, I suppose. So 2 troops in the Gulf States. Fair ally. Okay. Afghanistan is a poor ally. And it has 6 troops there, right? That's sort of the regime change aspect. So, and this is staying there at war. And there are 2 cells there. And the country is considered to be a regime change. So this is marked with regime change. So, oops, we're going to get the regime change marker out. Oops, it's under miscellaneous. Regime change. And it goes there. And it is considered to be on the tan side, as it's been like that for a while. Pakistan is a fair neutral. And it has 2 cells there. Uh-oh. Okay, the United Kingdom is hard on the war on terror. France is hard, and Benelux is soft. And that brings us to the +2? Yeah, because there's 3 hard countries and 1 soft country. Okay, and of course all these extra things are there. Okay, so we're going to make this a 3-deck game. And this is the start of the Awakening scenario. Let's go ahead and deal out the starting cards, just like before. In this case here, we can see that the jihadist funding is at moderate and the U.S. is at war. So it's going to be 8 for each. So let's go ahead and deal those out right now. Before we do that, though, we need to initially create the deck. And you can see here that this game supports both the create deck for just a brand new game or the Arab Spring, which was the scenario that split the 2 cards between the Awakening Reactions half and then the Civil War half. But we're playing Awakening, so we're not going to be using this button. We're going to be using the Create Deck button instead. You just click Create Deck, and then bada bing, bada boom, combines all the cards, and you have a new deck, and we're good to go. Okay, so we're going to do out the starting hand. So the US gets 8 cards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And the jihadists get themselves their 8 cards. 6, 7, 8. Okay. Now, the next question we'll ask ourselves is whether we want to play as the United States or the jihadists, but I will leave that for the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope all the rules we covered were not too much to bear, but yeah, that's sort of how things go when you cover brand new expansions. A quick disclaimer, of course, all the rules and all of the things we see here is in beta and is subject to change, and this is current as of the current date, which is August the 3rd, 2015, and I am using the bots that are marked version 1.7, so keep in mind what you see here might be different if you play it at a later date and if you follow the rules I did. But this video should have been good enough to get you up to speed with how to get the module, how to read the rules. I covered some of the interesting aspects of the rules. Very quickly, we talked about the awakening reaction markers. We talked about how they can influence the alignment and governance levels of Muslim countries over time without the player's interaction. Typically, those markers will be placed by event, by the way. We talked about how polarization can happen at the end of each turn, which, again, converts those countries up or down, alignment or governance. We talked about how convergence occurs when a country goes to good or Islamist rule. The rest of the Muslim world reacts, and more of those markers are potentially placed onto the board. We talked about civil war, what happens when the country goes into civil war, how those markers are removed, replaced with troops, security forces or cells. We talked about how a civil war can end and what sort of happens. We talked about the attrition part, which is after polarization, sides inflict hits on each other, and that can cause attrition to occur. We talked about the changing of the WMDs from Central Asia to Syria and Iran. We talked about how there's some new player mats for Iran or Mali or Nigeria. We talked about the caliphate, how that can be established by an event placing 3 or more cells. And yeah, that's about it. Remember, the victory conditions are the exact same, and this game does not add any new base actions to either side, so it's fairly simple. But at the same time, there's a lot more things to keep track of. Okay. Thank you all so much for watching our introductory video of Let's Play Labyrinth, The Awakening, 2010 to ? And we will begin with our 3rd campaign of this Let's Play series shortly. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.